Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Chiang, and I just wanted to come on here to share the operational control letter that was signed on March 25th, 2025. As I think that it's very important for us to be aware and understand the full scope of the proposed operation in the state of Yap, as it not only affects our generation, but it will affect future generations as well. And so I think that before decisions are made and before any final decisions are made, that all parties are fully informed and have all of the important information that they need to make informed decisions prior to those decisions being made. So with that, I will read the operational control letter that was signed on March 25th, 2025. And before I continue, I just want to apologize in advance for any mispronunciation of names in this letter. Whereas on September 15, 2021, the U.S. Embassy Colonia, via diplomatic note number 20-181, requested permission for the U.S. Pacific Fleet and U.S. Pacific Air Forces to work directly with Yap State government to begin detailed planning of port and airfield improvement projects. Whereas on September 21st, 2021, the Federated States of Micronesia, Department of Foreign Affairs, transmitted a copy of diplomatic note number 20-181 to the Honorable Henry S. Fallon, then Governor of Yap State. Whereas on September 22nd, 2021, Yap State Governor Fallon communicated to U.S. Embassy Colonia via the Honorable Kandi A. Elesar, Secretary, FSM, Department of Foreign Affairs, that Yap State stands ready to provide any and all relevant detailed information to the port and airfield improvement teams specified in diplomatic note number 20-181. Whereas between September 22nd, 2021 and the date of this operational control letter, OCL, the state of Yap, the FSM, and the United States have had numerous discussions concerning the need for an OCL and the nature of the military construction projects proposed for Yap, including several joint committee meetings and meetings with Yap State leadership. Whereas on March 12, 2024, the Yap State leadership had met, discussed, and made its decision on the U.S. military site establishment in the state of Yap, addressing key priorities that needed to be addressed, which included the following pillars: maintenance, safety, social, and environment. Whereas on April 5th, 2024, an operational control letter of acknowledgement was signed by Yap State Governor Charles Chiang, which also highlighted key priorities identified by the leadership of Yap regarding health and safety of its residents, social impacts, land maintenance, and usage, together with environmental impacts, for a period of 5 years, with the option to extend for additional 5-year terms for land, subject to reasonable compensation to be provided by the U.S. Department of Defense pursuant to DFA LSR 159-24 diplomatic note, which operational control letter of acknowledgement was rejected on April 25th, 2024 via diplomatic note number 24-0084, and a request was made for Yap State Governor to sign a revised operational control letter of acknowledgement, providing the U.S. Department of Defense access to land controlled by Yap State for military construction projects. Whereas the U.S. Department of Defense has requested operational control of the land at the Yap State International Airport, Yap State, FSM, owned or controlled by Yap State, identified in Appendix A. Whereas the U.S. Department of Defense has requested operational control of the land at the Yap State Seaport, Yap State, FSM, owned or controlled by Yap State, identified in Appendix B. Whereas the U.S. Department of Defense has requested operational control of the roads and roadways between the Yap State Seaport and the Yap State International Airport, which are under the contingencies D-1 and D-2. Whereas together the lands controlled by Yap State identified in appendices A, B, C-1, and C-2 are referred to as the operational areas. Whereas the operational control, the U.S. Department of Defense seeks over the operational areas is operational control pursuant to 10 USC 2801 C4, and the U.S. Department of Defense's use of the operational areas is made pursuant to Title III of the Compact of Free Association between the United States of America and the Federated States of Micronesia. Whereas the U.S. Department of Defense is not seeking an interest in the land within the operational areas beyond the interests provided for in the compact and its subsidiary agreements. Whereas by accepting this OCL, the U.S. Department of Defense acknowledges that operational control does not constitute an interest in the land within the operational areas beyond the interest provided for in the compact and its subsidiary agreements. Whereas it is anticipated that the lands covered by this OCL will be subsumed in whole by the establishment of a defense site pursuant to the terms of the compact and its subsidiary agreements, including the acknowledgement regarding the military use and operating rights of the government of the United States and the Federated States of Micronesia, concluded pursuant to sections 211B, 321, and 323 of the Compact of Free Association as implemented by MUORA. Whereas the leadership of the state of Yap, including the Yap State Governor, Yap State Legislature, and Council of Pilung, are agreed that the military projects at the Yap State International Airport and the Yap State Seaport, including road system improvements, should proceed in a manner that is the least disruptive of the environment and respects the historic and cultural resources of the people of Yap. Whereas the FSM, the state of Yap, and the U.S. have agreed that the government of the United States shall apply the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 as amended, as if the Federated States of Micronesia were the United States, to the military projects at the Yap State International Airport and the Yap State Seaport. And whereas the FSM, the state of Yap, and the U.S. have agreed that the government of the United States shall also comply with standards substantively similar to those required by the Endangered Species Act of 1973 as amended, the Clean Air Act as amended, the Clean Water Act as amended, Federal Water Pollution Control Act, Title I of the Marine Protection, Research and Sanctuaries Act of 1972, Ocean Dumping Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act as amended, the Solid Waste Disposal Act as amended, when constructing and using the military projects at the Yap State International Airport and the Yap State Seaport. The state of Yap, through its governor, authorizes the U.S. Department of Defense operational control of the operational areas to enable construction, rehabilitation, alteration, reclamation, improvement of facilities and infrastructure, and use by the U.S. Department of Defense for training, transit, support, and other related activities conducted pursuant to Title III of the Compact with the following understandings. Number one, no ownership interest of land. Operational control is not a grant of ownership of or transferable interest in land. Number two, period. Operational control is authorized for the U.S. Department of Defense for a period of 7 years from the date of execution of this OCL. In the unlikely event this OCL is not superseded in its entirety by the establishment of a defense site, it may be extended for additional terms of 5 years at a time as mutually decided between the U.S. Department of Defense and Yap State. Within 90 days of the date of the execution of this OCL, the U.S. Department of Defense or lead agency shall provide to the state of Yap a written project description, which shall include an update on construction planning and reasonable foreseeable operational use. Within 90 days of the execution of this OCL, the U.S. Department of Defense or lead agency shall issue a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement pursuant to requirements set forth in the Compact of Free Association. Within 90 days of the execution of this OCL, the FSM, the state of Yap, and the U.S. Department of Defense or a lead agency shall meet and confer to a mutually agreeable date and time for the scoping meeting or meetings pursuant to the Compact of Free Association, which scoping meeting or meetings shall occur within 6 months of the date of execution of this OCL. Number 3, supplementary conditions and understandings. Operational control of the operational areas is understood to include the following supplementary conditions and understandings. A, the U.S. Department of Defense intends to explore with the FSM government and U.S. Congress avenues to provide reasonable funding to Yap State to retain environmental consultants to assist in the technical development of environmental planning and permitting documents for U.S. Department of Defense projects. B, pending provision of such funds referenced above or enactment of any necessary authority, the U.S. Department of Defense intends to use its best efforts to contract with an environmental engineering firm acceptable to the United States and the Yap State EPA, provide reasonable assistance in the technical development of environmental planning and permitting documents needed for projects undertaken in the operational areas. C, the U.S. Department of Defense intends to provide biological and cultural resource monitors during construction activities and for a reasonable time following construction within project fund availability windows where monitoring is required by applicable environmental planning mitigations or permit conditions. D, the United States acknowledges its existing obligations under Article 14 of the Status of Forces Agreement concluded pursuant to Section 323 of the Compact of Free Association as amended and the MOU-RA regarding respect for local law. E, the leadership of YAP has identified key priorities regarding the health and safety of its residents, the potential social impacts of this project, the maintenance and use of land related to the potential projects, and the potential environmental impacts. In recognition of these priorities, YAP State, the FSM national government, and the U.S. Department of Defense will meet, engage in good faith discussions, and negotiate a process within the next 6 months to ensure that these priorities are addressed. The outcome of these discussions will be documented and incorporated in the forthcoming FSM U.S. Defense Site Agreement. F. Under this OCL, the U.S. Department of Defense acknowledges its obligations to the FSM, including the state of Yap, pursuant to Section 311(b)(1) of the Compact of Free Association and its commitment to implementing the highest standard of safeguard measures to protect the residents of the state of Yap from any threats or attacks. In fulfilling this commitment, the U.S. Department of Defense shall utilize its best technology, its best available technology, strategic planning, and military assets to ensure the most effective defense and security measures are in place to the satisfaction of the state of Yap and the leadership of Yap. Number 4, Yap State Seaport. The anticipated construction efforts at the Yap State Seaport envisaged under this OCL are as follows, and may be the subject of further consultation and modification between the U.S. Department of Defense and Yap State. Constructing 2 warehouses and a laydown area with appropriate fencing at the Yap State Seaport and improvements to wharves within the joint use area identified in Appendix B at the Yap State Seaport. A, the construction of 2 warehouses within the area identified as a lease exclusive U.S. use portion on Appendix C, as was identified through consultation between the U.S. Department of Defense and Director of the Yap State Department of Public Works and Transportation are mutually determined. The warehouse and laydown areas within the identified area are notional and may vary so long as they remain within the area identified. Each warehouse is anticipated to be no larger than 10,000 square feet unless mutually decided by the App State Department of Public Works and Transportation and the U.S. Department of Defense. The warehouses are intended to store equipment and materials for the purposes identified above in the introductory clause and for humanitarian purposes. Based on the representations made by the U.S. Department of Defense to Yap State, it is the understanding of Yap State that the U.S. Department of Defense does not intend to permanently store weapons, ammunition, or explosives in the warehouses during the term of this OCL. The U.S. Department of Defense is the exclusive authority to control entry and use of the exclusive U.S. use portion on Appendix B, including the warehouses and laydown area. C, during the period of operational control, the warehouses are to be maintained in accordance with U.S. Department of Defense requirements, including those related to life, health, and safety. During the period of operational control, the U.S. Department of Defense is responsible for the operations and maintenance costs of the exclusive use portion on Appendix B, including the warehouses and laydown area. D, the U.S. Department of Defense is responsible for the installation and payment of all utilities, including electric, water, and sewage for the warehouses and laydown area. E, the U.S. Department of Defense is not to permit or license use of either warehouse, the laydown area, or the space therein by a third party unaffiliated with the U.S. government without the prior written consent of the state of whose consent is not to be unreasonably withheld. F, upon request of the state of Yap, the U.S. Department of Defense may provide, consistent with U.S. requirements and on a space available basis, storage area with the 2 warehouses at no rental cost. Number 5, defense site designation. The state of Yap understands that it is envisioned that the operational areas will become defense sites pursuant to the compact and the MUORA. Upon establishment of a defense site that includes an operational area, the defense site designation will supersede this OCL. Number 6, non-interference. Activities conducted by the United States in the operational areas are to be consistent with the non-interference provisions set forth in Section 2, Article 4 of the MUORA. Number 7, use of operational areas. Except as set forth in Section 4, the operational areas remain areas of joint use for the FSM, including the state of Yap and the United States. The U.S. Department of Defense, in consultation with, after approval by appropriate state of Yap authorities, may temporarily limit access to portions of joint use areas when reasonably necessary for U.S. operations and activities. In consultation with, after approval by the state of Yap, portions of the operational areas may be exclusive use areas for the U.S. Department of Defense for a specified period of time. For purposes of the OCL, joint use means that the state of Yap and the United States have use of the area of the operational and security concerns of Yap State and the U.S. Department of Defense. In using joint use areas based on the representations made by the U.S. Department of Defense to Yap State understands that the U.S. Department of Defense intends to use its best efforts to A, avoid interference with commercial activities in the state of Yap, B, avoid interference with access by fishermen to shoreline areas, C, avoid interference with navigation, aviation, communication, and land or water travel in the state of Yap, D, avoid impeding access to recreational areas by residents of and visitors to the state of Yap, E, minimize damage to terrain and to reef areas and implement appropriate mitigation measures required for environmental planning or permitting. F, avoid unreasonable harm to the environment, including water, mangrove, and taro patch areas, and implement appropriate mitigation measures required through environmental planning or permitting. G, avoid activities which would adversely affect the well-being of the residents of the state of Yap and their cultural and historical resources. And H, notify the state of Yap of non-routine activities so that the government of the state of Yap may take steps to assist the government of the United States in executing its responsibilities to minimize any adverse impact of such activities. Number 8, private lands and waters. This operational control letter does not authorize access to or operational control over private lands and waters. Number 9, release. If, prior to establishment of a defense site, the U.S. Department of Defense determines that any operational areas or portions thereof, including any improvements made by the U.S. Department of Defense, are no longer needed by the U.S. Department of Defense, it intends to release control of such areas back to the state of Yap, provided the U.S. Department of Defense incurs no expense to do so. In such cases, Yap State understands that the U.S. Department of Defense intends to provide a modified appendix to the state of Yap with a copy to the FSM, reflecting revisions consistent with the return of these areas, including divestment of improvements made by the U.S. Number 10, dispute resolution. If the event that any dispute or controversy arising from or related to the requirements of paragraphs 2 and 3, the state of Yap and the United States shall meet in good faith and make reasonable efforts to reach a mutually acceptable resolution. Such discussions shall take place promptly upon the written request of either party. Number 11, operative OCL. This operational control letter supersedes all previous operational control letters relating to operational areas, whether signed or unsigned, including drafts and formally transmitted operational control letters. And all as such are hereby rescinded and terminated. However, nothing herein supersedes any authorization or indemnification relating to vessel or junk removal where those activities were authorized within the operational areas. And with that, I encourage everyone, especially landowners, to watch and rewatch the video. There was a lot of information. Make sure that you are taking notes. And if you need any clarification or if you have questions that you need answers to, I encourage you to ask those questions to your leaders and ensure that you have all of the relevant information and all of the answers to your questions prior to making any decision